Hey guys, what's up? Public here, back with another video, and I know it's been quite a while, but I wanted to finally make kind of an official here's how I play Shadow Priest and Mythic Plus guide. So I'm going to try to go over everything you need to know to play Shadow at a pretty high level inside of Mythic Plus. A lot of this is going to be kind of a video version of what I already have written in my Icy Veins guide, so if you haven't checked that out, or you prefer a written version, do check that out. It's linked in the description. Without further ado though, let's get into it. Okay, so Mythic Plus, there's a lot going on. Before we get into kind of how you play dungeons or how you do things, let's cover talents really quickly. This is going to be the kind of big question that a lot of people have of how to play Shadow and Keys. The big question here is kind of what you want to do with your build. You can kind of configure Shadow in a few different ways of saying, yep, I want a bit more single target, I want a bit more AoE, or maybe somewhere in between. And it's really about kind of making those decisions for your group and kind of what you're looking for. If you're just trying to simply top the damage meter, if your goal is overall damaging a key, you only have a couple builds that I would strongly recommend. I did cover this a little bit in my kind of talents guide for 10.05, so nothing really has changed here. There's two primary builds you want to kind of keep in your back pocket. The Cthulhu and Yogg-Saron build, or the Yogg-Saron build with N'Zoth. Both of these builds you do take Mindseer with. So the differences between these two I've already kind of hinted at already. So Idol of Cthulhu in general, and kind of going down through Mindflay Insanity, Scream to the Void down to Idol Cthulhu, that's the kind of preferred build for generic anything keys. You can basically take this, every key, every affix, every group, doesn't matter. You do always take this with Mindseer. And the kind of pros of this build, it does have the best single target of our kind of generic AoE setup build, so there's that. Both of these actually you can use Dark Ascension or Void Form. It's totally up to you. I think a lot of people, including myself, prefer to run these builds with Void Form, but should you prefer to run with Dark Ascension because the pull pattern is nicer, like you like that 1 minute versus 2 minute cadence, you can make both of these work, no problem. So would definitely say if you kind of want your generic build, rock Cthulhu and Yogg-Saron with Mindseer. Now, if you're looking for something that's a bit more on the kind of AoE side of things, and you're comfortable losing another, like let's just say 4%, 4 to 5% single target, something in that range, you can actually drop the Cthulhu side of things. You keep Mindflay Insanity, but instead you pick up what is typically Malediction, and then N'Zoth on that kind of bottom right hand side. You can absolutely do this. This is a bit more AoE, and obviously the pull pattern changes a little bit by getting a 30-second Void Torrent instead. So I use this primarily in keys like Ruby Life Pools and Knockhood. It seems to be kind of where I get the most value out of this, especially because on the kind of the main downside with this build is the loss of single target. But in Knockhood and Ruby specifically, there's a lot more kind of 2 targets or things like that in the bosses to kind of make up for it a little bit. So that's where I'll use that build. Can more or less make either one of these work with either Void Form or Dark Ascension, like I said, on any key or combination. So with those kind of 2 base builds and then changing out Void Eruption and Dark Ascension, you kind of have 4 talent builds. You can look at it. So if you're in a key like Court of Stars, Temple, or Shadow Moon, where it is a more single targety dungeon, maybe you rock Cthulhu Yogg-Saron with maybe even swapping to Dark Ascension, depending on how your group pulls around it. And when I'm saying that, it's purely, are you going from pack to pack to pack, not doing a whole lot of chain pulling? Dark Ascension is really nice for that. You basically have a cooldown for every single pack. Or if you're chaining like 2 or 3 packs together and doing big bursts of packs, that's where Void Eruption can really shine, doing that kind of big damage on these 2-minute cycles. So you can kind of make either work in almost any dungeon. So both of those builds are linked down below, and like I said, you can swap kind of Dark Ascension, Void Eruption based on kind of what you want in that key. Now I do want to cover just briefly, a lot of people talk about this Node Mindseer build that gets linked, or you might see a lot of people in high keys running. In general, I would not suggest running builds that don't run Mindseer. The main reason for that is if you care about overall damage, it's always going to be worse. So that's just kind of the nuts and bolts of the build. Unfortunately, it just doesn't do overall damage. Mindseer starts beating Devouring Plague at 3 targets, or 2 targets with a Mind Devourer proc. So because of that, any build that doesn't use Mindseer, you're losing out on quite a bit of overall damage. So that's kind of why, in general, I don't recommend it for basically any key level, to be honest with you. Now, some people prefer the playstyle with not taking Mindseer, and if you do that, you know, that is one benefit. But you really don't get much else out of it. Some people will say that you get more priority target damage by dropping Mindseer and running this kind of like Yasharj N'Zoth build. But just to put this out there, those builds have lower single target by about, you know, anywhere between 2 to 5% damage single target loss over the standard Cthulhu build. And the overall key damage will go down by about 10% as well. So if you care about overall damage, that's not the build you want to target, although you do get kind of a slight increase in priority target damage because obviously you're sending your Insanity into Devouring Plagues over Mindseer, which is definitely a difference in damage output for sure. It's something you might see or people might want in really high keys, but in practice I don't think it works out as often in most keys. Although, you know, something like Court of Stars, maybe it makes more sense. So there is that if you want it. But still not, you're not getting very much. And the big kicker here is, with any of the Mindseer builds that I referenced before, if you want more priority target damage, you can just start pressing Devouring Plague. Nothing is stopping you there. Where these kind of other no Mindseer builds kind of pick up steam is, you know, they have a few other talents that they're swapping around, but realistically, you know, it's not something that I would suggest running for most people. Now, if you prefer the damage, you know, play style, you think it's more fun, by all means go for it. But if you're talking about overall key damage, it's not something that I would suggest. Another thing people say about dropping Mindseer, you are more mobile. You don't have to sit there and channel Mindseer as much. So it's a build. It's something that again, I wouldn't typically recommend people try out. But it's there if you want it. Again, I would say for most people, 99% of keys you would do better off damage-wise. In terms of overall damage, both sims and logs all point to us that Mindseer builds are just better. So that's talent builds. Hopefully that gives you some insight into kind of when you pick which build. There's not a whole lot of changes in the kind of spec tree other than that. And that's your kind of spec tree talents. Okay, so let's cover class talents just real quickly. There are some class talents that you might want to change depending on the key. The Icy Veins guide actually does a pretty good job in detail kind of listing out when to swap to each utility piece. I'll kind of call out the main ones, but basically as you start a key, you definitely want to evaluate your class talents if they make the most sense for that key, that affix week, whatever else it is. The questions are more or less the same every key. The first one is, you know, do you need Mass Dispel? You know, is it bursting week? You should always take Mass Dispel. A lot of keys have some kind of value out of Mass. I would say in almost every key you want to run Mass. There are a couple where it's definitely less valuable and you could put those points elsewhere if you want. But, you know, there's quite a lot of things like Algathar is nice, Ruby Life Pools is nice, Asher Vault is nice, Court of Stars is really good, as well as I think Shadow Moon and Temple for sure. So Mass Dispel is a pretty big one. But should you not need it, like Halls of Valor is an example where, yeah, Mass not really doing anything for that. You can pick up some other things. Other questions, do you need Purified Disease? This is almost exclusively, I think, just like a Shadow Moon Burial Grounds thing where you want to have Purified Disease. It's a nice thing to have. Again, not required, but definitely nice for your healer, especially if you don't have a disease spell for the bat and spiders, I believe. Another question, do you need Shackle Undead? I think for the most part, this is basically just Halls of Valor, although I think you can run it in Shadow Moon too, depending on your strat. So Shackle Undead is another thing that you can take when you need it, should that kind of come up. And then for the most part, the only other kind of optional thing that, you know, you might sometimes take is Phantasm. So this has really kind of situational use cases, and some bosses you can just get good use out of it. The main one that comes to mind is the last boss of Azure Vault. You can clear your stacks of that kind of movement speed reduction with Phantasm. There's a couple other things, like I said, mentioned in the guide, but make sure you're kind of evaluating your class talents. Should you not need any of those things, you can always path down towards, you know, the Holy Nova side of things and grab something like Spell Warding if you want that kind of damage reduction. Otherwise, it's a lot of preference. You know, if you want to path towards Power Word Life to get a bit more defensive or that kind of healing output, you know, you can always do that. There's a couple options down there as well, but otherwise, class talents should be pretty static, should look pretty similar across the keys. You just have some small choices you can make there. All right, so let's talk about rotation inside of Mythic Plus. So this is a hard one to put into a video, but I want to kind of do my best to give you some guidance on what you should be doing from pull to pull. The big kicker here is things will change depending on what abilities that you have, the kind of pack size, the state of what's happening. So you really want to be kind of clued in on what your group is doing. So for example, if you're just pulling a really small pack and you know you're about to pull a very big one on the next pull, you might opt to save your CDs because it's a bit harder on the next one. You do kind of in general want to use your cooldowns on cooldown as much as possible. The goal is to get as many uses of them as possible in the key. But you really need to evaluate that. Another example that pops up quite often when you're talking about like cooldowns and rotational abilities is, well, if the boss is the next pull or maybe 2 pulls away, maybe you should still hold your cooldowns if it's like a really hard tyrannical boss. That being said, if it's fortified, not as important to have your cooldowns up for the very start of the boss, as long as you get them at some point in the fight. Lust timing is another big one you want to play around. Like if Lust is coming up in a minute, probably shouldn't blow your 2-minute cooldowns, right? It's usually better to save everything to line up for Lust if you're only waiting that long. Again, really depends on the state of the key and what you're doing. The other thing to think about with your cooldowns and using them is the other members of your group. Depending on the key level, I would say if you're shooting like at your level of progression, so what that means is if the key is hard for you, like it's score for everyone in the group, everyone's kind of at that same level with like item level. Generally this is less of a problem, but should you be like slightly lower or really lower than kind of where your prog level is at? So let's say you're currently progressing through like 23s and 24s, and you find yourself just doing a 20 key with a bunch of people that have almost 420 item level. Everyone using their cooldowns on a pack would be overkill, right? That means the group would effectively have more damage than is necessary unless you can afford to do really big chain pulling. So that's another thing to factor in. What other group members are doing on that specific pull? If you have other people in your group that are completely blasting, maybe you hold off and then you blast the next pack, right? These are all kind of strategies you need to think about, and kind of what your goals are for the key. You know, are you trying to blast overall damage? Do you want the tank to pull around your cooldowns? Or are you trying to time the key, right? These are all can be very different goals at some time. But that being said, kind of let's just talk about an opener when you have everything available. You're fighting 3 to 8 targets, that kind of range. That's our kind of sweet spot for Shadow right now. So I'll kind of go through the opener. Again, this is listed in Icy Veins if you prefer it. And, you know, you kind of see me on the screen doing this a little bit. The first thing you want to do when you walk up to a pack, typically the tank has to do some amount of grouping, especially if he has to chain these pulls together. It's really important to do this as the tank is grouping up mobs, as they're kind of coming into the group, before melee is even hitting them, just as the tank gets threat. You should be casting Vampiric Touch on these targets as they're grouping up. Now, the problem with that is obviously you'll take threat. The tank probably has not hit them very often, so you got to be careful here. Luckily, we have a cheat code, which is Fade. So this is referred to as Fade pulling. What you do is you press Fade, and then you start Vampiric Touching mobs as the pack is getting grouped up. That aggro effectively just gets dropped during that time, kind of allowing you to start the pull earlier than you would have otherwise. So this is really key for if you're like chaining packs together like Halls of Valor or something else like that, where you might be grouping a couple packs into one space. You can kind of pre-dot things, which is really crucial because the next thing you want to do is then Shadow Crash when they all get grouped up. With the kind of default talent build, this will apply Vampiric Touch and Shadow Word Pain to up to 8 targets. So if you're fighting more than 8 targets, getting even 1 or 2 Vampiric Touches out ahead of time will really save you going into the pull. So that's your opener. The tank is starting to pull something. Cool. Do it with him. Cast Vampiric Touch on mobs as they're grouping up. Once they get grouped, you can then open with your Shadow Crash. After that, you generally want to use Shadow Fiend here. In most builds, you're not going to be running Mindbender, so Shadow Fiend here, Mindbender, whatever. And then, depending on the cooldown that you're using, the opener will change. If you're using Void Eruption, you then immediately want to dump your 2 charges of Mind Blast, and then you can go into Void Eruption with Power Infusion, maybe even Potion. If you decide that you want to use Dark Ascension instead, right after your Shadow Fiend, go right into Dark Ascension, Power Infusion. The reason we do that is because Void Eruption does reset the cooldown of Mind Blast when we cast it. So you want to get advantage of that just to get, essentially 2 extra Mind Blasts out, right? Now, after that, this is when you kind of go more into the, default rotation, so to speak. So after you're inside your cooldowns, then you're going to want to use Void Bolt, probably dump your Insanity at that point with Mind Seer. then you're kind of prepping yourself to get ready for your big Void Torrent and Mind Games burst with Psychic Link. So the goal with that is you want to make sure Void Bolt is on cooldown and you don't have a capped charge of Mind Blast. So what that means is Mind Blast by default has 2 charges, or 3 with Shadowy Insight. So you want to make sure that Mind Blast is not capped on charges, so you're not wasting that cooldown. So you want that to say 1 charge or something like that. That's kind of your goal there. And then you want to get your Insanity below 35. What that means is you don't want to have to cap Insanity at the end of your Void Torrent, because then you're effectively wasting damage. So in that initial opener, you're effectively juggling between Void Bolts and Mind Blasts, spending with Mind Seer until you get in that right cooldown state to be able to send your Void Torrents. If you're really on top of things, you shouldn't have to be delaying it more than, I'd say, about 10 seconds into your Void form. That's usually kind of the sweet spot of when this will start happening. If you find yourself going through it and you're not able to catch up with it enough, there's a chance you're playing with like low haste levels, something like that. You can just afford, you do want to send it eventually. If you're holding longer than 10 seconds, you at that point just send it. This is especially true if you're playing with 30-second Void Torrent. You really don't want to hold it any longer than 10 seconds as the absolute max in your kind of burst. After you finish your Void Torrent, you probably need to dump Insanity again with Mind Seer. Then you go into Mind Games and then continue on with that normal rotation. So that's kind of what that looks like. And you're going to go through that on a pack-by-pack basis. You're going to recognize that if you have Shadow Crash up and available in the pull, it's a lot easier to start to kind of get going. Otherwise, you have to kind of manually dot everything. But with the standard build, that should be it. There's no kind of, you don't have to worry about dotting. As you cast Mind Seer, it should kind of sustain your dots, at least until Shadow Crash comes back off cooldown. And that's the kind of, the real trick here is how to use your Shadow Crash, how to redot targets. You might find yourself saying like, yep, the pack has, 20% health left on a lot of mobs. Maybe I just hold on Shadow Crash to make sure I have it for the next pull, so you can start each pull kind of fresh. But that's your kind of goal with the rotation. So hopefully, me talking about it and showing it helps. Have some background footage as well, but yep, that's the kind of generic opener or rotation for Mythic Plus. Okay, to close out the video, there's a couple of kind of small points I want to bring up. So the first thing we'll talk about is gearing. So gearing inside of Mythic Plus doesn't really change from a rating perspective. We still want lots of haste and mastery as our kind of second set. I think in general, you're going to find that haste is even better inside of Mythic Plus than it is inside of rating. If you're just doing kind of single target sims, you might be noticing as you approach like more than 30% haste, your sim might actually be telling you, hey, I actually want some more mastery here. But if you're looking at Mythic Plus or AoE scenarios, you'll see that bar go more towards haste still being good, even past 33% as kind of a standard amount. So there's really no kind of cutoff of what you want, although you kind of want to get as much haste and mastery as possible. That's still your goal for Mythic Plus. I will say, for those of you that are kind of considering these weird no Mind Seer builds, you absolutely should not be running those builds under any circumstance if you have low mastery. So please, I would strongly suggest using the Seer builds because that just works with more combinations of stats. So now, if we talk about other kind of gearing decisions, outside of that, let's cover trinkets briefly. So top trinkets, don't really change from like a raid to Mythic Plus perspective. So our big 3 that you want to get your hands on as a Shadow Priest: Whispering Incarnate Icon, the Furious Rage Feather, and Voidbender's Shadow Gem. Those are going to be your top 3 trinkets for Mythic Plus. Eye of Skullbald is actually not bad as well, although generally speaking, I would put that like as 4th best, although it does kind of depend on how you want to pull that key. So the benefit here is Furious Rage Feather is kind of an overall like trinket. It does pretty good single target and pretty good AoE. It's kind of combined together. It's a great overall damage trinket. Voidbender's Shadow Gem is really just empowering your burst. If you're pulling around your cooldowns really, really well, meaning if you're playing Void Eruption, every 2 minutes you're pulling a lot of mobs and doing a lot of big burst damage, you're going to get a lot of great value out of Voidbender's Shadow Gem. If you find you're playing Dark Ascension, you're pulling 1 pack at a time, not doing a whole lot of chaining, you're not going to get as much value out of Voidbenders, and that's where I would typically favor Rage Feather over Voidbenders. And then your second trinket, I would almost always use Whispering Incarnate Icon. The caveat there is if you're the only one in your group that has it, Icon's value does get lower. Ideally, your healer is using it, or even better, your healer and your tank to get maximum value out of this. So if you're running in a group that doesn't have a healer with it and doesn't have a tank with it, dropping Icon to use Rage Feather and Shadow Gem is probably the right play there, or Eye of Skull Vault if you want to do that as well. So yeah, those are the kind of trinkets that I would suggest. There's a couple others that are close, but those are kind of the main ones that you want to focus in on. And that should get you pretty far in that kind of landscape. As far as other kind of crafted stuff, I would still suggest running Elemental Lariat and Blue Silk and Lining as your kind of embellishment effects. You don't get as much value out as the potion one inside of Mythic Plus, even though Blue Silk and Lining is a little, it's not the best either. Mythic Plus, you could also experiment crafting the Chronocloth set instead of Lariat and BSL. To do that, though, you do need to have a pretty good neck. That's a pretty solid stats, which there aren't a whole lot of great ones out there. But the Chronocloth set does do decently well inside of AoE. You just need to have the right off pieces to make it work. But for most people, especially if you're raiding, you're probably already using Elemental Lariat and BSL as your embellishments. You can keep using that. And then obviously fill the rest of your crafted gear with other kind of haste mastery crafted pieces. And keep in mind the alchemical food pocket, which is the alchemy like thing, or it's not an alchemy thing. I guess it gets like a random drop where you can buy it off the auction house as an embellishment effect. Really, really nice for Mythic Plus, especially in progression keys. If you're dying or your group has a wipe, it keeps your food buff, so you don't have to delay there. So definitely something I would suggest picking up, if possible, if you can afford it, is the main question. So yeah, that's crafted items in kind of gear in a nutshell. Another thing I want to cover before I end the video is simming your character. A lot of you are probably already familiar with simming your character on like a single target basis, but I did want to kind of broadcast the ability to do that in a Mythic Plus scenario as well. So with the launch of 10.05, Shadow Priest sims are now supporting what is now called Dungeon Route sims. What this lets you do, if you're not familiar with it, you can actually take a route that's generated in Mythic Dungeon tools, that kind of route generating tool. If you build like an actual route and like say, yep, we're going to do this pull into that pull into that pull, you can actually then sim that entire dungeon to kind of see how you would perform. So for all the kind of internal sims inside of Warcraft Priest that we have published, we're using this and we're simming every key on Fortified and Tyrannical to kind of build our dungeon composite of like how, like what talents or gear or whatever is kind of good in those environments. If you would like to sim your own character on those as well, you are more than welcome to do that. It should work just fine. We're still kind of tuning and tweaking, but it's in a pretty good state for you to do that yourself. There's a guide on the Warcraft Priest page on how to do that if you're interested. If that seems like a lot of work and maybe too specific, the Dungeon Slice sim on Raidbots is fine. It's not ideal. It's pretty simplistic in what it's doing, but it's an okay representation of what you want to do. Just want to kind of be careful of treating it like gospel. The nice thing about the Dungeon Route sims they are very specific of saying, yep, this is a Tyrannical 23 knockhood, right? And it's like, yep, here are the bosses will live this long, the trash packs will live, at that level. So you can kind of see what that looks like. And depending on the key, that can really change up what you want to do. A build for Knockhood is not the same build necessarily of what you want to run on like Court of Stars, right? Very different mob patterns and types and that kind of thing. So that's the nice part about that sim, and it is available if you'd like to try that out. So just wanted to mention that is something you can use if you'd like, and hopefully that's helpful. Alright guys, that about covers it for Mythic Plus as a Shadow Priest. I know there's not quite everything here that I covered, but hopefully this gives you more detail if you're looking to get into keys as a Shadow Priest and you wanted to kind of see how I try to put things together. Again, my Icy Veins guide in the description is going to be the place where you'll get the most up-to-date information. We're constantly kind of tweaking things and learning new things, so this video might get stale, but all of the links in the description should continue to be updated for the next couple patches. So if this video has been out for a bit and you want to make sure it's still right, make sure you check the links in the description. Those will get you covered. But again, thank you so much for watching. Thank you to everyone supporting me both on YouTube, Patreon, all the helpful messages, or following me on Twitter even. I appreciate all the support, guys. I hope you've enjoyed this. I don't have a whole lot of time to make videos these days, but let me know what you want to see in the future or want to see next. I know a lot of you guys were talking about Mythic Plus and rotational stuff. If you want to see more stuff like this, but maybe a raid version, let me know. I can do that. I know the tier's already pretty in, but happy to do that still. So again, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.